Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different by changing out the front brake pads on my 2013 Triumph Street Triple. We'll be doing the work in the garage today, so pardon any background noise that you may hear from cars going by. Without going further, let's get to the video. Alright, so starting out with the most important parts, of course, is going to be the brake pads. These are EBC brake pads model FA226HH. They're double H centered brakes, but you can use whatever style brake pads as well as whatever company of brake pads you want to use for your bike. These are just the ones that were available to me, and these are the ones that we're going to go with. Now, next, going into the tools, there's not a lot of tools that are required, and most of them are simple. There's only one kind of specialty tool that you're gonna really need, and that's gonna be a torque wrench. Now, most of these can be had somewhere inexpensive at your local hardware store. Either what for me would be Princess Auto. In this case, as long as it goes up, I believe, to 21 Newton meters, it should be fine. It could be as small or as big as you want. Next, in a couple of screwdrivers, one's going to be a Phillips, the other one's going to be a flathead. In terms of screwdrivers, these are the only two that are going to be required. Followed by a 12mm socket, an extension, and the ratcheting socket. Final piece of tool that we're going to need is going to be a 5mm Allen key. Now, I prefer these T-handle ones, however, they're not absolutely required. You can use a normal Allen key or a multi-headed Allen key set, as long as it's 5mm. And then finally, for the basics of cleaning, some shop towels. Now, before we actually get to changing out the brake pads themselves, we're going to be starting up at the top of the bike around the front brake master cylinder. Now, because these pads are worn and we're going to be pushing back the pistons to allow room for unused pads, we're going to actually have to go through and suck out a little bit of the brake fluid in the reservoir. Now, brake fluid being highly corrosive, we're actually going to mask off around the master cylinder with some shop towel, just to make sure, in case there is a slight spill, that will be protected from the rest of the components. So in this case, this is where your Phillips head screwdriver is going to come into play. All we're going to do for the time being is loosen the two screws at the top of the reservoir. And then remove the cap. Now we're just going to put this to the side. Now, as you saw there, the cap was a little bit stuck on with the diaphragm, so I used a flathead screwdriver just to get it a little bit of persuasion to get it off. When doing this, be careful not to fling it around, as any brake fluid that flies out could potentially land on paint or other components and corrode them. Well, getting this finished, next we'll actually move on to the bottom of the bike to start handling the changing of the brake pads. Alright, finally moving down to the actual brake caliper itself. There's going to be a few things we're going to need to do here first. Well, we're going to start out with this down here. Now, this is just a little cap that prevents dust and dirt from getting into the head of the caliper pin. We're going to be taking off the cap with a flathead screwdriver and then loosening the caliper slide pin with a 5mm Allen wrench. Now, before we go through and start doing that, if you were to follow this cable up, you would see that there's a little plastic bracket here. All this does is it holds the wheel speed sensor close to the brake line. So what we're going to do for this job is, because we're going to be taking off the caliper, we're just going to unhook this wire from that bracket just so it doesn't get snagged up and gives us a bit more range of movement. So, start out, take your flathead screwdriver and undo the little cap. This can be taken out and put it off to the side for now. Be careful not to lose it. Next, we're going to take our 5mm Allen head and we're going to just slightly loosen the slide pin on the brake pads. Maybe a little bit tough, but go through and just break it loose. Lastly, from here, once we got the cap removed and the slider pin loosened, we can go ahead and remove the two 12mm bolts that hold the caliper onto the fork. These shouldn't be too tight. I believe they're only around 21 Newton meters or around 15 foot-pounds. We'll verify with the shop manual once we are putting these back on. And we go ahead and just loosen them bit by bit until they're able to come off. From here, we can go ahead and remove the caliper, being careful not to damage the rest of the wheel. And from here, we can now see our brake pads and brake piston. Now, moving on, we're actually going to take out the slider pin here from the caliper and remove the brake pads. What we're going to do that for is we're just going to confirm that the pads that we got do in fact match up with the pads that are already there. In most cases, if you have not yet opened the packaging on your new pads, it can be easily exchanged or returned to get the proper pads that you need. So, using the same 5mm Allen key, we're just gonna go through and undo the slider pin the rest of the way. Now, generally, once the threads have cleared the caliper body, you should be able to pull the pin out the rest of the way. Next, once that's out, what we're going to do is we're just going to slide the pads out. And then gonna go up to our workbench and confirm that the pads are the same. Alright, so we've gone ahead and confirmed that our brake pads are the exact same ones and they are the right model for this bike. So our next step is going to be to compress the caliper pistons to allow us room to put in the new brake pads. Now, I've gone ahead and removed the caliper bracket off camera. This is just to make it a bit easier on myself to be able to put in a C-clamp and to be able to compress in the pistons. Now, this isn't an absolute requirement and can generally be done by hand, but why go through the hard way and just save myself trouble. To do this, I'm just going to use a little bit of metal bar that I have had lying around in the garage. I'm going to go through and put it across both the pistons, line up our C-clamp, and start slowly compressing it. Once it's lined up on both top and bottom, just go ahead and start to slowly tighten the C-clamp. It's not going to take a lot of force, so just do it very slowly, just one turn at a time, and make sure that the pistons are going in. If need be, you can loosen it up, readjust C-clamp as well as the metal. Piece of metal to give yourself a bit more leverage. And retighten and continue compressing it. Now that we've got the pistons gently compressed, what we're going to do is we're going to put on the caliper bracket and we're going to slide the brake pads into place. Now, the brake pads generally only go in one way, and what we're going to do is we're going to start with the one closest to the pistons. Slide it into the slot at the top. Then take your outer brake pad. Once again, slide it into the slot. And then I'm going to take a caliper slider pin and reinstall it back into our caliper. You may need to do a little bit of finagling to make sure the pads are in the correct spot and that the holes line up so that you're able to put in the slider pin properly. But once it's in, you're going to be able to take your 5mm Allen key and tighten it back up. Doesn't have to be fully tightened. At this point, we'll worry about all the final torque measurements once we have the caliper back on the bike. Now, you may have noticed that your pads have shifted a little bit during all this. So just use your fingers and get them back spread apart. And then, allowing that, we can take the caliper with the new pads and slide it back onto the rotor. Now, once slid back on, you can do is just take one of the caliper bracket bolts and just slightly put it in just to hold it in place. So, before we put both the bolts back, we're actually just going to be using a little bit of blue thread locker. It doesn't have to be a lot, just to help seat the bolts, make sure they don't back themselves out. While we have one in place, we're just going to put a little bit of thread locker on the second bolt and tighten it up by hand. Once we've done that, we can take out the first bolt that we put in just to hold the caliper in place and put on a little bit of thread locker on that bolt as well. Now with that in place, we're going to torque both those bolts down. Now, the spec for this is 21 Newton meters. Now, and because my torque wrench is in inch-pounds, the translation is roughly 186 inch-pounds. Now with our torque wrench set to 186 inch-pounds, as well as a 12 millimeter socket on extension, I'm just going to go ahead and torque down both the caliper bracket bolts. Now, when you don't have it fully tightened, you can just go slowly one by one before doing the final torque, just to make sure everything is even seated correctly. Finally, we can go through, take our Allen key and do the final tightening on the slider pin. And lastly, take our little dust cover and screw that back on. Doesn't have to be fully tightened, just make sure it's nice and snug. So this fully takes care of the brake pad change. The other side is an exact mirror copy of how we did this one, so I'm not going to bore you with the additional content. Now, once you've done this, make sure you put the cap back on the master reservoir and pump the little brakes a bit to get the pads seated properly.